Time to unlock the next features of our app by adding Vuex to it. In the terminal here, I'll open a new tab, and then I need to install as a production dependency Vuex. npm install save Vuex will pull it down as we learned it. And this now gives me access to Vuex, of course. With that set up, I'll add a new folder to my source folder. I'll name it store. And in this folder, I'll create my store.js file. That's what each Vuex setup basically starts with. There I need to import Vue from Vue. And I also, of course, need to import Vuex from Vuex so that we get access to these two packages. Thereafter, it's time to use Vuex in our Vue application. And then we can start setting up our new store. We want to export this. So this new Vuex store with a capital S here. And this gets an argument where we configure the store. Now, as you learned, what does a store have? It has a state, actions, getters, mutations, and so on. Now, regarding the state, I will create two modules in this Vuex setup, one for the portfolio and one for my stocks. Each of these modules will have its own state. I actually don't have anything in my global state here because I want to map the stocks which are available to the stocks module I'm going to create, and the funds, for example, will belong to my portfolio. So this is what I'll work with. Of course, you may choose a different setup, but for that, I'll create a new folder named modules. Now in modules, I'll have a stocks.js file. I'll later also add a portfolio.js file, but let's start with the stocks. So in there, I want to create my new state, which is an object where I basically have an array of stocks, just like this. Now, how do we want to manage the state? What do we need? Let's start with the mutations to understand how we possibly could change our stocks. The first mutation which comes to my mind is that we want to set our stocks. Because let's think about it. Our stocks here, how do they ever change? Well, they need to be set, either because we loaded them from our server or because we loaded the app. And they need to be randomized when we click end day and want to recalculate prices. So there are two mutations which come to my mind. And now regarding the naming of these mutations, I'll give them a name which deviates from the one I chose in the last module. I'll take kind of this middle way between using the namespaces and the constants, which is this very complicated setup, and giving them normal names. I'll use a string as a name where I say set stocks, mainly also because this, if you use the Vue developer tools, allows you to easier identify your mutations. So this set stocks here is a method, of course, where we get the state, and we know we'll also get the stocks because we want to make sure that we pass the stocks as a payload to this mutation. Therefore, here we can say state stocks equals stocks because we know we get new stocks passed as an argument, and we want to edit our existing state by overwriting these stocks there. Now we'll also have a random stocks mutation, let's say, where we get the existing state, no payload, but there we want to randomize our stock data when we end a day. I'll work on this later. For now, let's start setting up some actions here. Now regarding the actions, which actions do we need? Well, I want to be able to buy a stock, and here I'll use a normal function. You may, of course, again, name these things as you want to name them. I'm going to use a normal name here. And buy stock is now, of course, also a method where we get this context object where we only need the commit function. So I'm going to use destructuring to pull out this commit function of this context object, and then the order. So this is this setup here. And that, of course, needs a colon in between like this. So now this allows me to buy a stock. And in buy stock, I now want to commit a certain mutation, but none of the mutations we have in this file. Instead, one of the portfolio file, which I'll set up in one of the next videos. So I'll leave this empty for now. We'll continue working on this. We'll also have set stocks here, which only takes the commit pulled out of this context object. And there I then want to run commit on set stocks. And then we also need to pass some data here. Now, which data is that and where do we get it from? Well, right now we have our stocks in this stocks.view file here. Well, that's not really the ideal place. Now, you could get them from a server in the internet. I'm going to set up some dummy data source here in my project. So I'll create a new folder named data. And in there, I'll create a new file named stocks.js, where I simply want to export a default object, or default array I should say. And this array, of course, is or holds these items I set up here. So I'm going to copy them in there. So these are my stocks now in this stocks.js file, and that could of course be an external data source. It just happens to be not an external source in this project here. And then with that set up, I can add an import in my stocks.js module here, import stocks from, and now we have to go up a level and then to the, and then one level more, and then to the data folder, and then here the stocks file. And these are the stocks from this data stocks file I want to pass here, because these are the stocks with which I want to initialize my application or initialize my stocks. Therefore, we could also name this init stocks. Maybe it makes much more sense because we only call that once we initialize our stocks. We'll also need an action to randomize our stocks, so I can already set this up, randomize stocks. And here again, I will only need my commit function here. And then with that commit function, whoops, outside of the parentheses though, with that function here, I want to commit random stocks with no data because it doesn't need data. And again, I'll come back to writing the logic for randomizing the stocks in one of the next videos. Well, finally, it's time to set up some getters because we also want to see our data, right? So the getters we need, you may choose any names you want. I'm going to name it stocks here. And the state is the argument we do get in such a getter as you learned it. And with the state, I can simply return state stocks. Of course, referring to this stocks array I set up here in my state. Well, and with that, it's time to export that all in one object. So export it in a JavaScript object. And in this object, we do have our state, we do have our mutations, we do have our actions and our getters, of course. Not like this, getters. And with that set up, I can get now back to my main store file. And here I want to import this module. So let me add an import stocks from, and now from the modules folder and then the stocks.js file. And then in this store we set up here, I simply add modules and add my stocks module. It's the only module right now, but it has everything to get this store started. And with that, the final step, of course, is to add this store to our main.js file. So here we want to import it. We want to import store from this store folder and then the store.js file. And after importing it, we can simply add it with the shortcut to our Vue instance here. Now, with this in place, we see our app is broken because we never call init stocks. We never initialize our app. So let's make sure we do that. And a good place is in the app view file and here in its created method, because that is when our root instance here is finished initializing. So here I want to call this $store. I do have access to the store since I set it up in the main.js file here. $store dispatch, and then let's see, we named our action here in this module init stocks, this name here. So this is what I'll dispatch as a string. And after doing so, we can now go to the stocks view file. And here, of course, we now need a stocks array to loop through. And we can use our getter for that. So we can add the computed method here to now get our getter here. And I could set up map getters, but since I only have one getter I'm interested in, I can also simply name it stocks. And here I will return this store gathers stocks like this. And with that in place, if I save this and go back, we see our stocks again, but now managed through our central Vuex store, which isn't finished, but we achieved quite a lot there. And in the next video, it's all about setting up the portfolio state, managing the portfolio, and making these buy buttons work.